Will you ever stop addressing me and what you think of me and actually present evidence for a resurrection?
Fine. The evidence for the resurrection is he really died. And a Roman soldier took a spear and jammed it into the
How
side
you know
of
that?
Christ, and an issue of watery serum flowed out separated from the side of Christ. We read in the Gospel of John.
You haven't answered my question. Quite right.
Welcome back, everyone, to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're going to take a look at a video that was posted on the channel Valuetainment Short Clips. Now, as you can probably guess from that channel name, this video is a clip, and it was taken from an episode of the PBD Podcast, which is a show hosted by fundamentalist Christian Republican and CoffeeZilla exposed financial grifter Patrick Bet-David.
Oh, buddy! We've been needing to do this one for a while. Patrick Bet-David, ladies and gentlemen, owner and founder of People Helping People, an MLM focused on life insurance,
who runs his podcast as a sort of echo chamber for spreading far-right extremist conspiracy theories, bigotry, Christian nationalism, and Christo-fascist ideologies. Now, in this clip titled Evidence That God Exists, Patrick sits down with Cliffe Knechtle, a Christian YouTuber who pretty much runs the Ray Banana Hands comfort routine of recording himself arguing aggressively with college students like some unhinged JV football coach who never quite got his shot at college ball, and then selectively posting to his channel the encounters in which he doesn't get schooled by someone who recognizes his grift for exactly what it is. Now, for anyone not familiar with Cliffe's rhetoric when he's in the wild, he often makes a huge deal about what he claims is the totally obvious evidence for the existence of his God, while never actually providing anything to back up his fallacious assertions.
Oh, there's a big surprise!
But we're not in the wild today, so I think it'll be interesting to see exactly how this fundy grifter addresses this topic when nestled snugly in the safe space of Patrick's echo chamber. The floor is yours, boys.
Your favorite people to debate when you're going out there and you're talking to kids. What's your favorite conversation when you're having with them?
What I really enjoy is talking to someone who has totally dismissed God, was an atheist like you were at one point.
First off, Patrick, what Cliffe does there during his open-air events on college campuses, which pretty much amounts to him standing in an open space lecturing at the students around him in their time between classes where they're probably learning to do actual productive work in the world, is so far out of the ballpark for what a debate is, it may as well be guzzling coffee at 3 a.m. in a Denny's booth sitting adjacent to the jobless emo kids arguing about why their self-loathing is justified. And there's a huge problem with what you said there, Cliffe, because your context is beyond misleading. An atheist is not someone who has simply dismissed the concept of a god, and that's because an atheist is someone who does not believe that a god or gods exists, and they don't believe that because they have not been convinced of the truth of that proposition. Thus, their self-identification as an atheist is logically justified. What you've done here, Cliffe, is deliberately articulate that statement in such a way as to subtly imply that atheists are just dismissing the proposition of a god out of hand, and in that implied intellectual dishonesty are simply not doing any of the work necessary to justify their position. Your listeners who are believers will then in turn pick this up as an implication that atheists do in fact believe, or at minimum suspect, that there is a God, which in turn you will probably go on to crow loudly in some unsuspecting student's face validates exactly what it says in your Bible. Essentially, Cliffe, you've used a direct misrepresentation, otherwise known as a lie, to validate what your book says, to then in turn validate yourself and the Christians who listen to you. And last I checked, your worldview says that's a big no-no.
Totally dismiss Christ.
Yeah, most people dismiss the Christ narrative once they've realized that the Christian worldview actually renders it illogical.
And I love to begin to pile up the evidence that God exists.
Okay, here we go. Let's get all that evidence you say exists.
A lot of evidence that God exists. A lot of evidence that Jesus really rose from the dead.
Wait, what?
Wow, you hold that the resurrection is an actual historical event and not just a theological claim, essentially flying in the face of the amassed biblical scholarship from both believers and non-believers alike from around the world. I mean, I can understand if you held that the crucifixion was an historical event, sure. I mean, who weren't the Romans crucifying back in those days, am I right?
Always look on the bright side of life.
But the implications of your position are that a supernatural event was directly recorded into human history by verifiable independent sources. I cannot wait to hear what evidence you think supports that.
A lot of evidence that the New Testament Gospels are historically reliable.
Which of course would imply that you've accounted for the numerous direct contradictions in the narrative of the Bible, which means you've either figured out how to determine which version of the story is true, or you've apparently solved how contradictory events can both simultaneously be true. These claims are stacking pretty high here, Cliff.
And when I begin to see the eyes change, and the facial expressions change.
Likely out of utter disbelief at how ridiculous your attempts have been to justify these claims in the past.
And when I begin to watch them, realize, oh gosh, I can't dismiss God as a fairy tale.
Well, the only way that would be possible, Cliff, is if you've either presented the actual evidence that your God exists independently of mind and context, or that you're talking to an assembled group of people who lack the philosophical acumen to challenge you on your claims and point out the fallacious argumentation you use to support them. But that's okay, Cliff. That's why I'm here.
I cannot dismiss Jesus as a fairy tale.
Well, the part about a cult leader wandering ancient villages preaching heretical Judaism, yeah, you could take that on probability alone. It's the supernatural crap that you actually have to back up, Cliff. Just because a guy named Oily Josh may have run around the ancient world with a band of greasy followers, does not logically entail that this Iron Age David Koresh was supernatural in nature.
Instead, I'm going to have to take him seriously.
Okay, let's get to this evidence you've supposedly got so that we can see exactly why we should take it seriously.
Oh, Patrick, that just lights my fire.
So, if I get this straight, you get off on taking advantage of the ignorance of young students in large social settings, a situation in which their conditioned social dynamics often lead to them inadvertently committing association fallacies, which allows you to weaponize their disempowered position against them so that you can better spread your message.
Oh, creepy.
Yeah, I bet. Is there a common thread you notice that comes up where you can sit there and say, my professor said this, my teacher said this? Do you notice a trend and a pattern?
Well, of course that trend is going to exist, Patrick. A simple Google search will reveal the demographics that are represented by the people Cliff most often talks to. And they aren't philosophical scholars who can point out on the fly when Cliff is committing a non sequitur or begging the question or affirming the consequent. They're freaking kids, man. Kids fresh in college for whom the authoritative professor-student dynamic is firmly internalized. Fresh students rarely, if ever, openly challenge the credentialed authority figures in their lives, especially when those authoritative figures are teaching them at the collegiate level. It's an entirely lopsided dynamic, and not only does Cliff know that, he needs it. And that's because his only real recourse is to inject himself as an authority figure into groups of unquestioning, uncritical kids who literally do not yet have the education to know how to respond to his nonsense. He needs that lack of a presence of intellectualism in order to have a conversation.
Yeah, there are different academic levels on different campuses.
You say you recognize that, Cliff, but I don't see you directly engaging with those individuals who have the capacity to stand up to you.
But coming to faith in Christ is not primarily an intellectual thing.
Oh, really?
Then why exactly is it that you spend so much time claiming that there is scientific evidence for your God? Or is all of that really just a subtle admission that all of your scientific evidence for your God is really just a collection of God of the gaps arguments, and that ultimately you're just begging the question of your God's existence?
It's primarily an issue of the heart.
True, faith is an emotional position, and thus is not an epistemological tool. And that is because emotions alone do not indicate what is true. In fact, as numerous studies on human behavior have revealed, emotional positions are more likely to indicate bias. You must be able to confirm these things independently so that you can know them to be true, and with a methodology that can eliminate your potential confirmation bias. And after this entire process, one of the best things we could possibly get to confirm that truth would be a predictive model. You constantly seem to forget, Cliff, that just because you personally feel that these things are true because you either want them to be or need them to be or have simply been convinced that they are, does not logically entail that they are in fact true.
I'm a follower of Christ because of God's love that was shown to me through my dad and my mom.
Can you demonstrate that it was God's love? Or was it in fact love from your parents who conditioned you to believe that it was representative of God's love? Statements like this are literally just razzle-dazzle bullshit that ultimately mean nothing and do nothing, other than Cliff getting off on listeners eating up his own self-validation.
And there is nothing that's going to dissuade me about Christ because I have experienced his love in my life.
That's not good at all.
There's another problem there, Cliff. Because you don't possess a mechanism by which you can differentiate between love coming directly from a God through the actions of people who believe the same thing that you believe, and love you've been conditioned to believe is coming directly from a God through the actions of people who believe the same things that you believe, and because without first demonstrating that the God exists to give love, you're begging the question of its existence, then you cannot legitimately say that the love you've experienced comes from this Christ figure. And even worse, the reason why nothing will ever dissuade you from this is because you are not interested in the truth. You're only interested in what you personally want to be true, and in what you can personally gain by convincing others to think as intellectually dishonestly as you do.
But then as you grow, you have to think it through in terms of, is this the truth, or was I just cleverly hoodwinked by my parents in believing this?
Oh shit. It's almost like Cliff is fully aware of all of the rebuttals that he's gotten over the years from people who know how to deconstruct his claims. It's probably why he does everything he can to not engage with them. And I think there's no better evidence of this than the performance given by Cliff and his son Stuart when they thought it would be a good idea to sit across from atheist good cop Alex O'Connor. You can check out that objectively hilarious exchange over on Alex's channel or his Substack.
So you've got to be a skeptic.
First true thing you've said. Now let's see how fast you can twist it to fit your narrative.
And there's a place for that.
That was fast.
And I was just reading the Gospels with a question, how many times did Jesus ask questions?
What does that got to do with anything?
Well, according to various biblical scholars, Jesus asked somewhere around 300 questions, and he answered only 3 of the over 180 questions asked of him. The problem, however, is not that Jesus was asking questions. The problem is what exactly Jesus was asking. And that's because the vast majority, if not all, of the questions that he is written to have asked were completely rhetorical. The only real purpose the questions that Jesus asked really served was to reinforce the way of thinking that he was espousing. Suffice to say, citing Christ when the topic of conversation is skepticism is patently ridiculous. You'd actually be better off citing Nicodemus, who pointed out the apparent contradiction in Christ's claim about being born again, to which Christ replied, to put it simply, "Trust me, bro."
Do you know he asked over 290 questions?
Who cares?
I've seen the claim of the number of questions range from 307 to 339. It really just comes down to these individuals choosing to include or not include certain questions. But ultimately, this entire thing is irrelevant because the fact that there exists a story about a cult leader who asked questions is not evidence that a God exists. Now we're going to go ahead and skip this little part because it's just Cliff talking about Luke 15, which is the parable of the lost sheep, which was pretty much written to reinforce the Jesus character's claim that even the lost can attain the kingdom of heaven. It also happens to be completely irrelevant to the discussion as to what his evidence for his God is.
He's challenging us to think clearly through the issues.
That's not right.
No, that parable was decidedly not about Jesus wanting people to think clearly or critically. If the character had truly wanted the shepherd to think critically, the question would have been, which of these two actions is wiser? To maintain the safety of the herd and one's own livelihood by remaining with them despite losing one's stray, or risk the entire lot by leaving them alone and unguarded in the hope that you may be able to locate and save the one that's lost? And the answer there is of course the former, especially when it applies to someone whose entire livelihood is herding sheep. But seeing as how the character of Christ was a carpenter and not a sheep herder, questions pertaining to risk analysis and the long-term economics of sheep herding were probably beyond him. Or maybe he just went around thinking that he knew better than everyone else regardless of the risk to others. I mean, he apparently had his greasy gang steal some poor sap's donkey just so he could ride it into the village and make it look like he was fulfilling Zechariah 9:9. Just because you might be an expert in one field doesn't make you an expert in all fields. Which oddly brings to mind that there is no biblical reference as to just how good of a carpenter Jesus actually was. I mean, it's not like we got an entire chapter on the Christly art of first century beveling. Maybe that's why he stopped cutting roof beams and opted instead to start preaching heretical nonsense around town. In fact, that kind of reminds me of someone else who failed as an artisan and then went on to become a megalomaniacal cult leader who claimed that he was God's instrument on earth. But that could just be a coincidence.
So that's why it's such a privilege to talk with people and ask, what do you think?
Yeah, but the people you target to ask have not yet been taught how to think critically when engaging with someone like you, Cliff. Were you to ask, say, someone like me, I'd say that the lack of sufficient evidence, any predictive modeling, and the incoherency of the God category, as well as the numerous logical fallacies that one must first commit in order to hold that proposition is true, ultimately renders the holding of such a position, by the way, predicated solely upon your own subjective personal experience, from which you possess no mechanism to eliminate the possibility of your confirmation bias, as completely irrational. I'm also going to skip this next section because it's just Cliff waxing on about an experience that he had in which, after doing one of his open air sessions at Columbia, he then sat in on a class in which the professor was discussing the differences between John Calvin's and Huldrych Zwingli's views on war. To put that in a quick nutshell, John Calvin was a Protestant who held to the just war tradition and also held that Christians should never interfere with the faith of other countries, while Zwingli held that war was absolutely necessary to convert Catholics to Protestantism. Now, apparently after this class, Cliff asked the professor if he believed in God and Christ. And according to Cliff, the professor answered that he wasn't a good person to ask that question of. And for some wild reason, Cliff seems to think that was super duper scary.
That was scary!
But back in reality, it really isn't, Cliff. While you gave no name nor specific credentials for this postdoctoral grad from England that you supposedly engaged with, it is entirely possible that this person was an atheist, knew exactly who you were and what you were looking for, and simply decided not to engage you on it. Or it could be that he simply doesn't see himself as a theologian or particularly familiar with your brand of theology, and thus knows he's not really equipped to have that conversation with you. Hell, it's entirely possible that the guy had just finished teaching a class and didn't want to get into a discussion with you.
No! Get away from me!
Because we, the audience, have so little information to go off of, we can't honestly conclude that if this story actually took place, it has all of the necessary elements to justify you calling it scary. And because of this, the entire anecdote is rendered completely irrelevant and is only meant to stir up the emotions of the believers who already listen to him.
That's an unexamined life.
And that would be a bullshit, cowardly indictment of someone's life who isn't there to call you on it.
You don't know what you're living for? You haven't analyzed what motivates you through life?
Maybe he has, maybe he hasn't. Maybe he currently still is. Who the fuck are you to decree that what he has or has not decided for his own life is evidence that his life is at all directionless or meaningless? The element of your own story that this guy is apparently doing post-doctoral work should have given you at least some idea as to what this guy's motivations are or what the driving force in his life is. Just because it doesn't line up with what you think it should be, Cliff, doesn't mean it's unrealized.
Did he tell you why he's not the right person to ask that question?
He just said, I can't answer you.
Which is, of course, a valid answer. That you don't like it is not his problem.
It's this big myth of agnosticism.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Agnosticism is not a myth. It literally means without knowledge. If a person doesn't possess the knowledge that a God exists, then that person is by definition an agnostic. And understanding how belief and knowledge are not the same thing tells us that every person on the planet is agnostic. You claiming it's a myth, Cliff, implies that you know for a demonstrable fact that every person on Earth knows that a God exists. Please feel free to demonstrate how you could possibly know that without begging the question.
Yeah, I wouldn't hold my breath.
That you can live your life not knowing. And that's intellectually acceptable and intellectually respected.
It is, because it's not only intellectually honest, it's humble. Claiming you know something to be true when in fact you do not possess that knowledge is not only intellectually dishonest, but it's arrogant as fuck. A synonym for that you may be familiar with, Cliff, is haughty.
Well, hello, Mr. Fancy Pants.
Like how you're behaving here, Cliff.
Patrick, it's impossible to live an agnostic life out.
Please feel free to show the logical contradiction entailed by someone not knowing if a God exists or not.
You have to decide, is this person valuable or not? If so, why or why not?
Those are moral distinctions and value judgments, which are entirely subjective to the individual, and a God is not required to make or hold them.
You have to answer the question, what's the purpose of my life? What's my ambitions and goals? You have no choice.
Also entirely subjective to the individual. What the hell does any of this have to do with agnosticism?
You have no choice but to make ethical decisions every day. Do you cheat the IRS or do you pay your taxes?
But there's a serious problem there, Cliff, with all of the things you're choosing to draw this analogy with. Every single one of the things you're mentioning, we can demonstrate that we have access to in reality. They are choices that each one of us makes on the daily regarding things that exist externally to us. By the very understanding of your God category, none of these things are analogous. Thus, none of them are relevant to agnosticism.
You have no choice but you have to answer the question every day. Am I going to lie or tell the truth? Am I going to cheat and steal, or am I going to respect another person's property?
Excuse me a sec. What are you babbling about?
You can add all of the subjective distinctions you want to that. It doesn't change the fact that they have nothing to do with knowing if a God exists or not.
And then, by golly, you're going to have to sit in funerals of grandma and grandpa and mom and dad. And I'm sorry, if you don't ask the question, is there life after death or not, you're brain dead.
Yak. Get a job.
You can certainly ask the question if there's an afterlife. There's no issue with engaging in thought experimentation. But if you hold that such a thing exists simply because you want it to be true, especially when there is no evidence to indicate the truth of the proposition beyond your own personal desire, then you are holding to an irrational position, and you must at minimum acknowledge that.
Am I going to see this person again or not?
Most likely, given the current evidence, you won't. Typically, that notion inspires people to make the most of the time they have. The real question is, can you be okay with that? And if you can't be okay with that, that's something you need to square for yourself. But I will tell you that glomming onto irrational nonsense so that you don't have to deal with it will only do more harm than good.
So you have to answer those questions. All of them. Everybody does.
Well, some of those you do, some of them you don't. Which ones are which is entirely up to you.
And that's why this idea of I don't know, you can't live that out.
Actually, you can when what you're stating you don't know can't be demonstrated to exist as anything more than a conceptualization. You can say, yes, I know that this God exists as a concept that some people believe is real and concrete. And you can also say, I myself don't know if this thing is or is not real and concrete. The only way one could not be an agnostic is if the God itself had been demonstrated to exist independently of mind and context. Try and remember, Cliff, that belief and knowledge are not the same thing.
You have to say, no, I'm never going to see this person again. Yes, I am going to see this person again. Why?
No, you can say, I don't know if I'll ever see them again. The evidence says it's likely I won't see them again, but it is within the realm of possibility that I may see them again in some other state or capacity that I am not currently familiar with. But until I demonstrate that one of those is actually the case, I can't make the statement that I know which proposition is true. I would be an agnostic.
See how that works?
Yes, there is a purpose to my life. This is it. Why do you believe that?
But now you're talking about belief when the topic at hand was specifically about knowledge. I'm starting to think that your entire presentation here was just you conflating atheism with agnosticism, which, by the way, is a rookie-level apologist move.
Yes, I think there are some moral absolutes, maybe not many, but at least a few. Why?
Well, no one, because moral absolutes don't exist. An agent's moral distinctions are only objectively true in virtue of their relationship to a desired goal. And until you demonstrate the existence of a mind-independent source of what all moral distinctions must necessarily be, that you don't personally like moral relativism or what it entails is just an appeal to consequence fallacy.
Who defines those moral absolutes?
Excuse me, the fuck did you just say?
Is that a real question?
Who defines the purpose of your life?
Probably a number of factors, but ultimately, again, the person themselves.
Who sets the ambitions that you are following? I mean, if you're a halfway thinking person, you've got to examine what's going on inside. What are you doing with your life?
How the fuck does any of this pertain to a God existing, Cliff? Because all I'm hearing is you whinging about irrelevant emotional appeals. You're not actually saying anything substantive. Where is your evidence?
You can't live agnostic.
Depending on what the proposition is, you most certainly can. So that was just a bald-faced lie.
If you ask me, hey, Cliff, you like Coke or Pepsi? I can say, I don't know, I'm agnostic.
Well, if you've never in your life tasted either one, then you wouldn't possess the knowledge of which one you preferred. So you'd simply say, I don't know. Now, technically, because you don't know, meaning you are without the knowledge of which flavor you would prefer, you would be agnostic in that sense. The problem here is, given the etymological history of the term agnostic, the term itself is predominantly used in theological contexts. So you using it here in this context context when what we're talking about are things that we have demonstrable access to in reality is very, very weird. And I know from prior experience that the only reason you're doing this, Cliff, is to try and draw a false association between the dissonance created when utilizing the term agnostic out of context and the word itself in an attempt to discredit it. It's precisely bullshit psycho word games like this that young students may not possess the education they need to immediately suss them out when you're barking in their faces, which is yet another reason why you choose to target them instead of individuals who can handle themselves. In the words of the 2nd century philosopher Celsus, you feed off faction and disunity, converting the vulgar and ignorant while refusing to debate wise men.
You're right. I don't know whether I like Coke or Pepsi. And guess what? It really doesn't matter.
Well, to that person it may not matter, and that's an entirely valid position to hold. Welcome to both apatheism and agnosticism.
But when it comes to God and the question of human value, human purpose, ethics, and is there life after death, you have no option but to face those questions.
Wouldn't you first have to demonstrate that the God actually exists, so that a person then possessing that knowledge could then tackle those questions? Remember, the topic here was agnosticism, which means not knowing. Not possessing the belief of, which would be atheism. So stop dishonestly conflating the two.
Could it be because folks who say that, they're so logical and everything has to be proven now, where the idea is no matter what I do, I will never get 100% answer to those questions. So why put my energy into something that is either faith or it's never going to be 100%. Why would I do that? It's not worth me doing that.
So that's actually a pretty important question. And the answer comes down to if the person being asked is more interested in knowing what is true than they are in simply accepting as true what is being presented. Some of these concepts can't be answered yet. Some of them may never be answered to anyone's satisfaction, if at all. And that is okay. It's okay not to know. And it is most certainly okay for you to choose not to devote your entire life to trying to find an answer for something that ultimately may never be answered. As Hitchens so eloquently put, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And for these guys to even slightly imply that not falling down on either side of the coin is somehow indicative of a grand failure on your part is more of an indictment of their own characters than I think they're competent enough to realize.
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
And here's what's wrong with that. You and I have beautiful wives, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Do you know your wife 100%?
I'm gonna have to cut you off there, Cliff, because yours or Patrick's or even my own spouse, no matter how much we love them, are not analogous to God. Our spouses exist external to us in reality. You cannot even demonstrate that your God exists independent of your own mind.
No.
No, and I don't know my wife 100%. Mm-hmm. Does that mean you and I can't have a relationship with our wives because we don't understand them 100%? No, we have a wonderful relationship with our wives.
Again, your wives can be demonstrated to exist in reality. Your God cannot. Thus, this is a false analogy. I swear, the masturbatory energy these guys summon up when firing off in the privacy of their own echo chambers is almost admirable.
In other words, you've got to live with mystery, and I got to live with mystery.
Not knowing every single one of your wife's aspects or thoughts is not the same as not knowing if a God does or does not exist, Cliff. Seriously, dude, this is below the bottom of the barrel apologetics. And you still haven't given any evidence for this God that you claim exists.
And if I can't learn to live with mystery, I'm going to have a horrible relationship with my wife, and you will have a horrible relationship with your wife. To demand that our wives tell me everything there is to know about them, they could never do that, and I couldn't grasp it. Well, if that's true about our relationship with our wives and our children, how much more true that is about a relationship with God.
And yet again, you haven't yet provided any of the evidence that demonstrates your God exists to warrant all this prevarication.
Where on earth do I get off with this intellectual arrogance that says, unless God answers every question I've got, unless I can understand everything about God, I can't believe?
Actually, I'd be asking, why the fuck am I asking questions of an agent that I can't even demonstrate exists to answer them? And we're going to go ahead and skip this last section because it's just Cliff and Patrick stroking their chins as they mull over the notion of accepting the mystery, as if the two of them, with their powers combined, created some throbbing brain giga-philossobro version of Captain Planet. All in all, this was nothing more than a glimpse into how the echo chamber works for Christian nationalists. The host props up the guest, allows them to spew the most ridiculous, unfiltered nonsense that comes to their mind, slowly feeds them sugary prompts so that they have the energy to push out the next logical logical fallacy, refuses to give any pushback whatsoever, and all the while usually being keenly aware of why their rhetoric is utter horseshit. Now, in light of this particular video, the aim to bridge the divide is not with individuals like Cliff and Patrick, but with the less educated people that may be listening to them, and those individuals who already know what game they're playing here. The only way to even this playing field and give legitimate rational discourse a chance is to facilitate the opportunities to critically analyze circle jerks such as these as often as we can. Remember, believer or not, you have your own voice, and these guys and anyone of their ilk do not speak for you. If you don't understand something, seek out the information you need to understand it. If you don't know the answer, don't be afraid to ask. And if you can't find a person who can answer it truthfully, do the hard work and find the answer yourself. In our society, we cannot allow individuals like this, who from behind closed doors denigrate those who would deign to challenge them on their rhetoric, and we certainly cannot allow them to dictate how and when and why we ask questions and seek truth. Because the moment we stop asking questions, the moment we stop holding them accountable for the potentially harmful claims they make, is the moment we've truly abdicated our very identities to the irrationality of fearful groupthink. And I, for one, think we're better than that. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, November is National Homeless Youth Awareness Month. A link to where you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you like what you saw here and would like to support this channel further, the links to channel membership and to get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear are down in the description. Once again, a massive thank you to each and every single one of you for your continued support. And as always, be safe, be excellent to each other. And together, we can bridge the divide.